Hello and welcome back. My name is Matthew. I'm the C# artisan, and this is the 7th video in my series on Azure Service Bus. And in this video, we're going to take a look at how we receive multiple messages in a batch. But before that, I wanted to address a couple of your comments and questions. Some people had a little feedback. So way back in the first video of this series, I kind of flashed a magazine up, Delphi Informant, and said, hey, look at me. I wrote articles on this way back in 2003. And some of you are like, wait, whoa, Tex, what's going on here? So the first question was, what on earth is a Delphi Informant? What is this? So Delphi was a Borland programming environment, like an IDE, where you could develop software. It was this concept of rapid application development, and the language was Pascal. So that's the first language that I learned. And the Delphi platform was actually invented by this guy, Anders Hejlsberg. And I'm just going to read the little Wikipedia bio here. Anders Hejlsberg is a Danish software engineer who co-designed several programming languages and development tools. He was the original author of Turbo Pascal, the chief architect of Delphi. He currently works for Microsoft as the lead architect of C# and core developer on TypeScript. So we owe a huge debt to this guy. How many of us, depend on these technologies? C#, TypeScript. I mean, he's the architect of this amazing stuff. So I was a Delphi programmer, and the transition to .NET was really pretty smooth because a lot of his concepts and ideas and patterns were right there in C#. So the next thing was, some of you were a little skeptical and you're like, hey, did you really write an article back in 2003? So I just thought maybe if I hold this up to the camera close enough, you can see the byline there, by Matthew Hess. And so yeah, I actually did. And then the last thing is, what on earth is a queued component? So I can't quite go into that in this video, but at a high level, today, if you want to have your software make a remote call to some other server, you're probably going to use REST. And you're going to use an HTTP call over, with REST. Before that, we used SOAP, which is kind of just like a strongly typed way of doing the same thing over the internet. But before that, what did people do? And one technology that was used to allow this kind of remote computer-to-computer method call was called COM+. And COM+ QC is a way to make those calls asynchronously. So basically your code, your Delphi code in Pascal, or your Visual Basic code, or your C++ code would create a COM object and call a method on that object in this special queued way. So instead of executing the method locally, it would put a message on a queue on the server. And then the server would read the message, rehydrate your object, and call the method over there. So the actual method would execute over on the server. Client and server had the same exact code. It looked as if you were just running it locally, but it was actually executing remote. So that's what queued components were for before we had REST or SOAP. Okay, so there you go, a little more history on that. But now let's go back to modern times and figure out how to receive multiple messages from Azure Service Bus. So here is our C# test project. And as you can see, I've cleaned it up quite a bit. Now, we're still going to use the same service bus receiver, but here, instead of calling receiver.receiveMessage async, we're going to receive messages async. And that is actually going to return an read-only list of service bus messages. And we can name our variable messages. And this method here, let me just use the IntelliSense. I'm going to copy this because I can use that in a sec. But if we say receiver dot receive, and now here it is, receive messages async. So there are two overloads, and we're going to use the second one. And this allows us to specify max messages. So imagine there were 10 messages in the queue, and you specified 5 here, you would get 5. And then if you called it again, you'd get the next 5. So we'll actually test that out. So I'll go ahead, put in 5. I do want the same time span that we were doing before, because our timeout, it's necessary, and you'll see that as well when there are no messages in the queue. Okay, so this gives us a list, and now we could say console writeLine messages dot count. That would work, and why don't we make it a little prettier? So we can say $ quote, oops, do a little string interpolation, messages dot count received. That'll be a nice log message. And then we can write our processing loop. So for each service bus message in the returned messages, and let's just write out the message body to string. That'll do it. And then we need to do receiver.completeMessage async. So we're going to query for whatever messages are in the queue, but no more than 5. And we're going to loop through them and write out their message bodies. So the next thing we need to do is tee up some messages. So if we look over here in the queue, I'll refresh that, and you can see I have no active messages. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just say, let's send 8 messages on in. So now I should have 8 messages. We'll refresh, and there we go. 8 active messages. Wonderful. All right, and I can set my breakpoint right here. So let's debug this project. And it's going to write to the console, which is on my other screen. I'll bring it over here in just a second, but here we are about to receive our messages. So let's receive them. And as you can see, it logged out 5 messages received. So that's good. And now for each message, we're going to write out the message body for, there's number 4, and that should be number 5. And now our app is going to exit, but before it exits, you can see we received 5, and then we logged out message 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we can just continue. And if we go back to the queue itself and refresh it, it should be down to 3, which it is. Okay, let's run this again. So we're going to run this thing one more time. And this time we should get 3 messages. So where's my console? There it is, 3 messages received. And for each one, we'll write it out and complete it. And looking at the console, there's messages 6, 7, and 8. Excellent. And now going back to our queue, and we refresh, should be down to 0. So let's do one last test here, and we're going to run this and see what happens when there are no messages in the queue. So we're going to do F10, 4, 3, 2, 1. The timeout should hit, and then when we log this, it'll say 0 received, and our loop just exits. So there you go. That's the basic technique for receiving messages. Pretty straightforward. There is one little subtlety to this that I want to mention, and that's this. When you receive this batch of messages, whether it's 3 or 5 or 100, the peak lock timer begins at that moment, okay? So you then have, let's say your timeout on your locks is 1 minute. You now have 1 minute to process and complete all of the messages in your batch. And if your message processing, if the thing you're actually doing is kind of expensive and slow, and that's likely because why are you using a queue in the first place? It's because this is slow and expensive and you want to offload it to an asynchronous process. So you just have to be aware that if your message processing on average takes 10 seconds and you're pulling 10 messages in a batch, that's 100 seconds worth of processing. So you need to deal with those locks either by extending the lock timeout or renewing them, which we haven't covered, or by just getting fewer messages in each batch. Okay, that's it. Receiving a batch of messages. Easy peasy.